So I
Yeah.
recorded
If you
and
could give me a sign, so the last 5 minutes of 7, then I can
sure,
find a nice round up.
sure. Hey Martina,
Hello, Kamet.
Hi, Nicole. How are you?
Hey, good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Um, Wait. Good evening, everyone. We are still waiting. We have 1 more minute and then we will give an extension. But
שלום מרגלית,
שלום וברכה, מה שלומכם?
בסדר.
היי. We will give 2 minutes to the late arrivals and we'll start.
Sorry, pushing around at my computer.
Sharon, should we wait? Can we start? Okay. Good evening, and thank you all for joining on another lecture in our joint oral history workshop series of the Lelbeck Institute, the Division of Oral History at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and the Israel Association for Oral History. Today, we will hear from Nicole Imler, Professor of Historical Memory and Transformative Justice at the University of Humanistic Studies at Utrecht, the Netherlands. Before she was a Marie Curie Fellow at the Newt Institute for War, Holocaust and Genocide Studies in Amsterdam, postdoc researcher at the Austrian Academy of Sciences, and from 2005 to 2009, she worked as the General Settlement Funds for victims of National Socialism in Vienna. In her research, she explores restitutions and reparation instruments in regard to historical injustice in different settings. Her PhD, a metabiography of Ludwig and Hermine Wittgenstein, sorry for my German, theorized the concept of family memory, further developed in her postdoc, The Afterlife of Restitution, examining how former victims of National Socialism and their families experience Austria reparation practices, analyzing the dynamics between family memory and reparation policies and practices. In her research on narrated injustice, she moved from Holocaust and memory studies into transnational justice, exploring reparations to Dutch Jewry and post-colonial groups next to each other, exploring risks of using one as model for the other. In her current project, which I'm sure that you will present here in detail today, she explores with a team civil court cases in the Netherlands, examining landmark decisions regarding historical injustice. Professor Imbler will present her talk, Connecting Oral Histories of Historical Injustices, for about 45 minutes, and then, as usual, we will have time for a Q&A. So, Professor Imbler, it's a pleasure to have you here, and the floor is, of course, yours.
Yeah, thank you, Ronnie and Sharon, for inviting me here to your oral history lectures. I'm really excited to be here and to discuss some of the new developments in the fields, or at least, the last developments also in my research. So I think, we are at a historic moment, I think, where anyway, thinking about how different kind of histories of injustice, connect to each other are very present in our minds and around us. So I hope that the talk can stimulate us a little bit to ask, how does this, what I talk today, relate to certain discussions we hear currently around us. So my talk has 4 sections. I will briefly introduce myself a little bit, where I come from, the different researches I did, which actually brought me then to the concept of multi-voicedness. I will introduce the concept first as a theoretical concept, but then also say, why I think we need a multi-voiced archive. So what is the benefit and how does it differ actually from a classical other oral history archive? I have to say we are in the conception phase. It's not yet reality, but I share here some of the thoughts and steps we have made in this regard. So I come from a PhD about Ludwig Wittgenstein and family history. And I think what's most fascinating is I put a quote here, which I think is a little bit the background also from the whole idea, the archive I present today. And he's language philosopher, and he always looked very much how the language structures the reality. So what can we see through the words we give, what we name things? So how our language provides the limits also from what we can see. And he also wrote a lot about representation. And he said, a clear representation produces that understanding which consists in seeing connections. So from him, I took the method of mapping, so that I'd map different voices when I write things or when I make oral history interviews. And putting voices next to each other is sometimes telling a story already of its own, which are voices that are more hegemonic, more dominant voices, which are unheard voices. And what I want to do in this talk today, to show you through this mapping the different connections between the different historical injustices I worked on, and which at the end will end up in the multi-voiced archive. It's part of my project, Dialogics of Justice. We have a homepage where you find all the details if there are questions. And there will become a publication on this topic, but it's still in the making. When I started, and Ronnie mentioned it already, so 20 years ago, actually, I worked in the restitution funds for victims of National Socialism in Vienna. And there it started my engagement with the question of the Holocaust in terms of, how does the afterlife look like? If we talk about the recognition of all the harm done, of the violence, how can recognition actually, what has the state provided? What kind of instruments have been there? And what of those instruments actually also, how were they experienced? So we know a lot from historians how difficult it was to get those instruments, for example, pensions or individual compensations, but also collective ones, support from all kind of different forms. But there was very little known about, how people experience these reparations. And then I use here now even the umbrella term for everything, which we have seen: apologies, financial compensation, restitution. But how do survivors, the children and grandchildren, what do they think actually about these different instruments? So I was intrigued actually by working at this restitution fund that I long did not know actually how measures are perceived and what could we improve. And I started this oral history project about, and here it's called The Afterlife of Restitution. So it was interviewing victims from Vienna, but many of those from Austria who fled, so who went to Argentina or to the UK, and who have earlier or later had a restitution claim at the Austrian towards the Austrian state or the national fund. And I visited with families, interviewing them about how they perceive those instruments, but also, of course, how the Holocaust resonates in their life, and what can we learn from all those experiences about what does matter in terms of recognition and, with all the limitations of what it can serve, but to get a better knowledge about, yeah, what there are a lot of assumptions in this field that instruments can do something. And I wanted to know, especially also from the young generation, second and third generation, how they look up at these instruments. In the last 2 years, I moved to the Netherlands, and there I came in contact with the colonial past from Indonesia in the Netherlands, and then later also slavery. I see the sheets have here intermingled a bit, but so in the Netherlands, I was confronted with two from other legacies, and both of those cases resonated also with the Holocaust remembrance in the Netherlands. And while you often talk about it as it is, as if there would be, a kind of competition between those memories, you also see, these groups, one memory facilitates also the other. There is a lot of referencing between, so for example, the colonial past. Many people say, use the same formulas, or want the same instruments, like how the Dutch government has dealt with the Holocaust past. So you see a lot of similarities between cases, and this is what I'm focused on a bit. So here you see, this was the announcement the Vienna Restitution Fund put in newspapers all across Europe and the US and the world, in order to find claimants, people that people know from those compensation funds. So there was the National Fund 1995, and later, after the Washington Agreement, there came this Restitution Fund in 2001. So there are different instruments. I don't want to get into details, because what we are talking today about is the oral history. And I have put here two photos which show a little bit the challenges of oral history when you are interviewing in the context from a recognition and reparation context. So you have a family history which you have on the files. So in the applications, people write things they know. In the archive, we find things which are documented. But what often happens is that things are differently remembered. So people sometimes ask for details, or had a different remembrance of, for example, what they owned, or what the relationships were between different family members. So, and what we could see then at the fund, the challenge to match family memory and what we have seen in the archive, and that sometimes there are frictions. And for example, what you in family memory often don't have is that people remember what has happened after the war for restitution instruments. So a lot of restitution did not happen after the war, but there have been several procedures, and often they were forgotten. And when then, the archive came with the details about those restitution instrument procedures after the war, there's a kind of, let's say, dissonance between, the expectations raised and families and also the memory. And on the other hand, what the archive tells. So this was one of the one of the lessons learned, that for me as an oral historian, not the archive is key, but what people remember, because what they remember is somehow the social reality, and this makes emotions, this makes feelings. So for me, it was a challenge to say, as a restitution fund, you need to react to the lived memory, so you can't say the archive is telling a different story. Now you have to understand why people remember certain things in a different way and actually respond to that. So here's the challenge of family memory. When we go to the colonial past in the Netherlands, so here we talk about Indonesia. Indonesia has a history of 350 years of being colonized from the Dutch. And particularly, we were talking in the Netherlands in the last years about the mass violence that happened in the decolonization struggle. So at the moment where the Indonesians wanted to have their autonomy and be independent, they had to fight for this independence. And these were 4 very bloody years where the Dutch, they didn't want to give up the rule. And we have seen in the last years several civil court cases in the Palace of Justice in Den Haag, where actually survivors from massacres in 1947 or 1949, they claimed recognition for those massacres by the Dutch state. And they wanted acknowledgement, to be civil victim. And because you might know, but a lot of those independent struggles were at the time of labeled as, terrorist actions, as unlegitimate claims. And all the people who were, were part of the violence were often, labeled as terrorists. And so this civil court case was very important to relabel actually and to acknowledge that they have civil victims, a lot of women, children, and there were whole villages who were, part of those police actions, as the Dutch state termed it at the time. And what was so special was that these old women that they won the court case. And we had, this happened in 2011. And then we had seen 10 years long of court cases extending the categories. So first it was women survivors who were acknowledged as victims, but later also the children of those murdered. And then also rape and torture became part of the civil court case. And one has to say the Dutch state always tried to hide and to neglect, but the judge forced them to acknowledge the evidence. And I followed these court cases over the last 10 years. And so what can these court cases, what do they deliver for the victims? And does the expectations they have, does this match actually with, what such a positive court case decision can do? One has to say, of course, that sometimes it takes 5, 7, 10 years until a procedure sometimes ends. It's a long time. It has it's difficult, there are groups who are often not well represented, or it's also group claims. So you have many people, but you only can, you can bring the evidence only from a few where the archive is there. So there's a little bit of mismatch in the court case setting around, you have individual evidence for a few of those claimants, whereas there's many people who have been, massacred. And so there's this mismatch between the court cases who, are good for the individual violence and to get attention, but you miss out a little bit on the massive violence which has been, out there in the late 40s. But the court cases, they resonated in an apology by the premier and later also by the king, Willem-Alexander. This was a major turning point, one could say, in this relationship between not so much only between the countries, but also how the Indonesian diaspora felt in the Netherlands. And I think this is something what I learned through the interviews, that when we look at these kind of recognition struggles, we always think there are two people. You know, there are those victimized and those who are identified as the perpetrators. But it's so often so much more complex because today you have a lot of Indonesians living in the Netherlands, and the diaspora, they have also hurt feelings of a different art. So they want to be acknowledged that they have this harmful past, that they lost a lot of privileges. So people who lived in Indonesia and worked for the Dutch, for example, they had to leave Indonesia because they were collaborators and they couldn't stay there. So they had to move to the Netherlands. They lost a lot of privileges. So there is harm of different forms. And this is at the moment still negotiated here in the Netherlands. And so here one could see at least how court cases can really do something in terms of also stimulating a broader debate about different forms of harms after the Second World War. Because in the Netherlands, we often celebrate 1945 as, you know, the end of World War II, democracy started. But just at the moment where democracy started, actually the massive violence in Indonesia just started. And this this period of massive violence was very long neglected. So we still celebrate 45 always as the start of, you know, the good post-war years, whereas for many groups in the Netherlands, this is not the case. And this has changed in the last years. And then we come, you know, in the last few years, especially through Black Lives Matter movement, we have a strong slavery reparation debate here in the Netherlands. It is also instigated through the CARICOM, the Caribbean Countries Union, who sued all European countries for their involvement in the Atlantic slave trade. This happened in 2013. And there was the 150 years anniversary of the abolition of the slave trade. And this kind of anniversary pushed a lot of debate about, you know, the role of the different countries in the slave trade. And also the question, you know, what can you do after 150 years, where some of the roles are, of course, much more complicated through the passage of time, and what is the right instrument? What we have seen so far is an acknowledgement of the slavery past. So there has been also an apology from the Dutch king towards the descendants of slavery in the Netherlands. And this apology is not just specific for the Atlantic slave trade, but what makes it very special is, and I give the quote here for this reason, he says, "My apologies for the obvious lack of action against this crime against humanity." So this is important to say, that it's a crime against humanity. So we discuss now the violence in the frame of the human rights canon, which makes it, of course, a different kind of acknowledgement. You see above right one photo of the demonstrations, which we see every year on 1st of July, the commemoration day, which is also now a national commemoration day, televised. And so something which has been a minority issue 15 years ago is now really national mainstream topic. We have a lot of research on this and a commission. It does not mean, but now where we are at the moment is the struggle is what is meant by reparation. And there are very different definitions of what repair is. And you see often that governments have a more narrow definition of reparation. And then you have the idea of, you know, one group has to pay something another group, which is you could say it's a financial transaction from one group to another. Whereas many community groups have a much more complex understanding. So nobody is really waiting for such a, you know, simple transfer. So this is more, you know, the general saying in the public, which is really misleading. But it's rather more, you know, many of those people feel from Suriname, Aruba, the Caribbean, you have all these racist structures still in European institutions. we call it institutional racism, has been really become a standard word. So they say, address these structures. This is reparation, that we develop from a second-class citizen into, just being a citizen of the Dutch state. And although, qua law they are, qua feeling they are not. So there are a lot of, exclusion mechanisms. If you look at the universities or you look at institutions, the ministries, they don't reflect the Dutch colonial past, not in any way. And I think here's a lot talk about power, hierarchies. And so when we talk about reparation here, it's rather more, and I called it more a repair of a social relationship, that those different hierarchies are addressed. And you see here one of the quotes of one of the actors who also spoke in front of the General Assembly of the United Nations. And she said there in her talk, reparation it's not about material repair, but it's much more fundamental. It's really about restoring every aspect of the rights of people of African descent. And you see here also it's a right discourse. So it's not about a gesture given by the state. No, it's about people having legitimate rights they can claim for. I brought you here one quote which was a changing point in my research, and something I heard when I spent last year a few weeks in Jerusalem and talking with different people, and then it reminded me of this. So on the left-hand side, you see this was a Roma survivor in Vienna telling me. And she said in one of the interviews, I asked her, how have you experienced all these different reparation instruments from the Austrian government? And she said, they do listen, but not much has changed yet. Was it supposed to change anything? My life and also the life of my daughters have not changed. What we have received makes me rather feel minor. I'm still a war victim. I feel so tired about this label. People also call us a minority. When I think of myself as a minority, I feel instantly inferior. I'm not a minority. I'm a human. So when I heard in this interview with her, actually, I was until this very moment, I thought, the minority status is something you want to have and you're proud of, you achieved something. Because in Austria, we are talking then, for example, that the language is acknowledged from the Roma and Sinti community, a radio, televisions, and the pension system, all kind of, you could call them achievements, at least I call them until this moment, until you realize that actually as a minority, you still have this kind of exclusivity status, which is linked back to the being victim of Second World War. And this is sometimes is a label you cannot get rid of. And that this label causes also all kind of unintended consequences, that you don't get rid of this label too. So for every benefit, everything you want to have from the state, you go back to being a victim of Second World War in order to get so. And they argue, no, it should be I'm a citizen. So I should have the right as a citizen to certain support, to certain kind of leistungen. And for me, this was a very intriguing interview. And also the question, what she says, was it supposed to change anything? Because you could say recognition instruments are there that people can really make a move in life, that it helps them to at least, for example, to do something. We all know that financial compensation is a problematic thing, that it's symbolic in many ways, but at least it can do something at certain moments for certain people. And for some people, it helps symbolically in order to, to give meaning to it, or can make, to at least experience a feeling that somebody has listened and that there was an acknowledgement. But sometimes people also say, it has to do more. My status in society has to shift. If I stay, the second-class victim from Second World War, I mean, where do I get? And this resonated a little bit what I heard, and I just give one quote from the weeks I spent last year in Jerusalem. But one of a Palestinian student who was in one of our conferences, and she also talked about what is minority status, that she sometimes feels as treated as a minority at Hebrew University. I have to say, it was a talk at Hebrew University, which is, of course, a specific place in Jerusalem. But for me, it was very intriguing, as I said, don't Nicole, they treat me as a minority while I'm not. And it never came to me beforehand that I am a minority. And yeah, that reminded me to the earlier quote I had in the Roma context. And I wondered, what kind of truth is in there that, having this, that people make you feel having this position is a very uncomfortable position to have. From this projects about the historical injustices, I moved to research other kinds of injustice at the very moment in the Netherlands, different court cases at the moment in Den Haag. And then we talk about also institutional violence by the church, sexual abuse and broader abuse by church institutions. We talk about the military failure in Srebrenica and other kind of peace missions where a lot of violence was used, which was not supposed to use. And we talk, for example, for Shell, the multinational Shell, who has a lot of oil extraction in Nigeria, but also here in the Netherlands, in Groningen, where they earn a lot of money and a lot of civilians have experienced a lot of harm which is not acknowledged and also not compensated. And we do this project in order to show, and I brought you here a model, because what comes evident when you're looking at these different forms of injustice. So we are a team, we are 8 people doing interviews in a similar style on these different groups who are victimized by an institutional actor. So institutions that don't provide acknowledgement for the harm they do, and also no compensation and no kind of support. What we often see in this oral history, so we do classical interviews, oral history, about who the people are, what they want, and then always key question is also what do you experience? What do you need? What do you need? What do you want actually? If you do a court case, so what is things your ambition? And then you often see that they ask very different things than what you can get at a civil court case. There you can get, for example, acknowledgement, you can get a compensation, and then it's a compensation from one actor to the other if you win the court case. But often they use different ways to describe actually the kind of recognition of justice. And it's very good modelized in this model here from the legal scholar Lisa Laprand. She called it continuum justice model. And whereas on the left wing, you see the narrow vision of justice, on the right hand, the broader vision of justice. And then on the left, I won't tell the details, but the narrow vision of justice is, for example, you have a victim and the perpetrator, and there's a clear transaction between the two. But the more you go to the right, the more actors are involved. For example, then also families, children, families, communities are involved. And then it's also about citizenship. It's also about socioeconomic justice. So it's not good enough that you have been harmed and you lost your livelihood, maybe, in the war, but that later on somebody helps you, to be also able to restore your socioeconomic position. So it's thinking about justice in a much broader way. And in the slavery reparation debate, for example, we see this. So few people are really on the left-hand spectrum saying, we're talking here about financial compensation from one specific institute to a specific group. I mean, this in many sense often does not make sense at all, but it's rather thinking about these structural legacies and how can we, as society, deal with the structural legacies. And here it's the society and politics as such are becoming part of the actors. And it's called, the left one is more an affirmative approach, and the right one hand side is more a transformative approach. And what I mean by this is evident in the next in the next sheet. This is also a recognition model from Nancy Fraser. And here you have, for example, at the left thing is affirmative recognition. This often happens at courts. It means that you are, for example, a victim and you ask somebody, you know, who has perpetrated you, and it's a kind of binary system. You have a clear position, the other has a clear position as well. And this is a kind of affirmative recognition. But having this recognition does not mean that your status in society can change. Therefore, you know, more actors would be needed. So for transformative recognition, it means that also, for example, going back to the Roma woman would mean that also her social position in the Viennese society will change. And this means that there are more actors, multiple parties need to be involved. And this is then families, institutions, society. They have actually to be, you know, part of the recognition giving institutions so that people can really change. And then we talk actually about transformative recognition. But a lot in our research, we see mainly affirmative recognition, I think. And here's one of the problems, that often these are very exclusionary mechanisms, often has to do with labels. People are also, you know, they can't get rid of these labels, whereas kind of transformative, change of structure so often does not happen. And whereas we talk today, so here this model, it's about dialogue between multiple parties. And I think the step we want to make with this multi-voiced archive is to show that it's not good enough that we have multiple parties involved, but we also have to acknowledge that people have multiple voices. So that, for example, going back to the Roma woman, I mean, I refer to her now permanent as Roma woman, because this is actually the label she has to get acknowledged. But Saya Stoiker is a name. I mean, she's so much more. So she's an artist. She's a family with a lot of children who are also, you know, have different positions in the Viennese society. She's a cultural figure in Vienna. So she has a lot of different sort of labels too. But this is not, you know, how you would approach her in the first way. So, and the idea of this project is how can we listen more to the dialogical, you know, how can people also get a little bit rid of these labels? And when we listen to these more, you know, multiple identities people have, and I don't talk about identities for a reason, I will give in a moment, but voices have, what would it help us to push the recognition debate further? And we have seen in the last years a lot of, you know, books who helped us to see that the identity debates we have, that they are in many ways pretty harmful, so that they can be very exclusionary and that they put, you know, people in groups. And often when we talk about the legacy of violence, it's what Kwame Antonia Appiah, I called it the lies that bind. He said the problem with identity is that it's mostly attached to a certain experience, whereas a lot of other experiences then are neglected. So you also silence part of yourself if you only define yourself through a specific element. And he claims all the other elements you have in your life history back into this debate. And then he says, people would realize that identity is much more in a flow, in a flux. And if you realize this, it would open you up more in debates with others to realize, you know, that there are no static entities. And so the claim is for a more pluralized society, it's actually the first step is to realize that these identities are much more, you know, they are created. So these are constructs we live as. It easifies often lives in complex situations, but he wants to discuss them more. And there are different books written on multi-directional memory, showing how, for example, the Holocaust memory in Europe came to the fore also through the memory of the colonialism. So how these memories often next to each other also help each other to be seen. So it's not always an exclusionary game or a zero-sum game, as Michael Rosberg has called it, but they grew together. And I think, I mean, you in Israel, you know it best yourself. The Holocaust and the Nakba are two memories who are really coming, out a very similar time frame, and they have a lot to do with together. But, you have the scholars who work on the Holocaust and you have the scholars who work on the Nakba. Also, that talks about it. So these are separate, knowledge systems. And this has grown in the last 20 years more and more. And I think the theological self or the mesh, the multi-voiced archive is an idea to follow up on these talks and to say, okay, when we have a more entangled approach, and this entanglement does not start with bringing groups together, but actually this entanglement starts in yourself. So in your own experience, all the other voices you might have too, but it's not so at the forefront. And I gave you here an article by a quote out the book from Michael Rosberg, The Implicated Subject. And he said, an implicated subject is neither a victim nor a perpetrator, but rather I can't read because I have your picture. Histories and social formations that generate the positions of victim and perpetrator, and yet in which most people do not occupy such clear-cut roles. So the term, I like it very much, this term of the implicated subject, because it shows also we as historians or the ones writing histories, we are implicated in several ways. For me, anyway, myself as a German, I'm implicated in so many ways in the Holocaust history, but I'm also implicated in the Palestinian history because I'm implicated in the Holocaust. And I think to see these different ways we are part of this, I think this is where debate is slowly moving to. And so my suggestion is, and we work with a concept, it's called dialogical self. It's developed by a psychologist, Hubert Hermans, who is very popular in the Netherlands. But there is a much longer history to it. I mean, Michael Bakhtin has worked with the dialogical imagination. Ludwig Wittgenstein has worked on it. There's been there's a long history on Martin Buber, the I and the do. So there's a lot of dialogue theory which comes first. But I want to limit myself today to the dialogical self and explain briefly the concept.
Nicole, I'll just say you have 5 more minutes.
I see. Yeah, I'm really late.
You can have 6.
So the dialogical self, then I go to this one. So the dialogical self is about, so you have different I voices you carry with you, and those I voices, they have also conflict with each other. So it's actually the inner dialogue do you have. And you see this here, you have the voice of the self, but you have different voices of the self, but you have also the voices of others, which also speak in yourself. And the whole idea is that these voices interact in yourself. And you see this in the image here. Somebody is reading his life story, but there are different, voices he is voicing. And I skip this and I give you an example. What we heard in the interviews, for example, there is often a binary thinking. So people say, oh, we often think so much black and white. So we heard this, for example, in the Holocaust interviews, that you are either against us or you're with us. And then you hear different I positions. And I show you here 2 I positions. The one is the I position, I belong to the Jewish community. This gives me strength, or I must pass on Judaism. Whereas the other I position from the same people can be, I don't want to have all this luggage. And I want to be normal. I want just to live my life in the here and now. So when you listen to these I positions, you often see contradictory positions people voice, whether they feel belonging and unbelonging. So all the doubts people have when talking about the identity and where they come from. And I think listening more to these complexified, you see also how the generation discourse gets more complex because there is connection, but there's also disconnection. While we talk often about the connection, we talk much less about the disconnection. And when you hear more to the dialogical self, actually you hear many more voices who also say, you know, also there's some, you know, some resilience in disconnect sometimes for a specific time from family or from community to give, you know, also to have your, yeah, the a kind of independency and autonomy. Yeah. I see I'm too long. Let's see, I cut a little bit. But here, for example, when we talk about what is a resilience I position, so we worked a little bit trauma and resilience and how these two positions relate to us. Mostly you think there's a trauma and resilience are opposing concepts. But when you listen to life stories, you often hear there are situations where you have more traumatic experiences, and in others, you experience a lot of resilience. So, how does traumatic eye positions and resilient ones, how do they relate to each other? And I gave you here just a brief, a few of those quotes. But for example, many I positions are then figure for connections, I as mother, I as daughter, or I as continuing the Jewish people. But you have also disconnections, I positions, for example, from the very same people who say, you know, I care in a broader sense, or that I want to see myself as liberated, and I need some more autonomy. So there are these I positions who are really in a, you know, conflicting situation. And when we now come back to the oral history archive, I think the oral history archive, and we call them, there are transitional archives and repertory archives. So there's a whole literature about it. And why did I feel I think here, this is my last sheet, the multi-voiced archive. I think the multi-voiced archive should be an archive that really allows this multi-voicedness to figure. So that we, yes, for example, when you see the oral history collections all over the world, you have on the Holocaust, on the Armenian genocide, on slavery, and they all have their collections. But what I want to do is connect them a bit more, and I'm not putting them next to each other, but I want to see how people voice things of experiences which resonate in the experiences of others as well. And then you see actually that there are very parallel and similar experiences. And I hope if people can see this, then this actually helps us to, yeah, to see recognition more, yeah, that the recognition to one group does not mean that, you know, another group gets less recognition, that we get out of this zero sum sort of the way we talk about acknowledgement. And I think the multi-voiced archive, so we experiment at the very moment, how can we show dialogical selves? For example, if we go back to the Roma woman, so how can I portray her in a way that I also show Saya Stoica, not just, you know, as a Roma, but also all the other ways she is as well. And how can you give some kind of acknowledgement to that? And how would this then again change the way we think about recognition? And this is a little bit the idea that at the moment where you where you show more these dialogical selves, that it also allows to see with other people from different groups their dialogical selves. And Hubert Hermans has shown this, that actually that you only can listen to complex histories of somebody else if you also have a complex history yourself. So if there is a mono voice from your side, you always also will hear a mono voice from the other side. And I think coming back to in the context we are now, I think, you know, complexifying one's own voice in order to be able to hear also a complex, you know, history from the other side could be a value. Well, this is a bit of project I'm working on, and thank you very much and looking forward to questions.
Thank you so much. It was fascinating and I couldn't stop writing, but before I have thousands of questions, but I want to give the audience the opportunity. to ask questions, and so you can either mark me or write in the chat. So I can start. Okay, so we have Shmuel, do you wanna just unmute yourself?
Yeah, you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. And I want to ask you a question. How, according to your opinion, multi-voiced oral history archives from Holocaust, from Nazism era, can support today struggles against poverty and against social inequality?
I heard it so. Ronnie, can you maybe rephrase?
Yeah, of course. I asked you how multi-voiced archives can support struggles against poverty and social inequality. Social inequality.
Now, for example, when you interview people and let's say you interview them because they have been, victimized by a certain incident or so. If you also provide them the possibility, people are often victimized because they are in a marginalized position. So it's the status they have already in society. So actually, to acknowledge this status in the first place would be helpful to find different instruments to respond to this marginalized position. So you don't respond as a state, for example, to the violence per se or the incident, but you acknowledge that the problem is a structural one. But as long as you think it's an incident, nobody will care about the structures. But the structures, they harm again and again. And yeah, I think this could be, if you display, and I think this is what we see. I mean, the abuse in church institutions, we all know it's not incidents. But what are precisely those structures that make that this violence comes, I think this is should be the value.
Sharon?
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Nicole, for this talk. I found it fascinating, the slide that you showed with the binary and the multi-voiced. I think also in democracy studies, we or people are trying to switch between conflict, which is binary, because if there is a conflict, so there is a good and bad, to the dilemma. And in the dilemma, you can see the multi voices, because in dilemma enable the people to cope with more than one or two options, or off and on, but it's more the variety is more clear. But I wanted to ask you about the multi archive, because how can we not fall to relativism? That's a question that bothers me, because if I take, for example, the German experience in the beginning of the 2000s, there was an attempt to build like a Zentrum gegen Vertreibung. It was the center against deportations, I can translate it, or something like this. So and this center, actually the aim was to show all the deportation that happened in the 20th century. Okay, so we can definitely earn something from this comparison, but we can also lose a lot from this comparison. And how can we just try to keep it in a safe frame of benefit and not losing from relativism?
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah, difficult question, of course. Yeah, because often it's this comparison. There's something to gain, but also to lose, because sometimes it's certain things are context specific. but very often they are not. And this I was surprised actually by this doing research with these very different topics, next to each other. That, for example, how the generation struggle, how the second generation, how important acknowledgement is, for example, for children. I mean, this is really everywhere. There's a kind of constant aspects. And I think if we understand these constant aspects, we understand much better, what is you don't compare it on historical ground, but you compare it more on, for example, what is the situation of the second generation in relation to the first, or like this talking about incidents of structures, the language you use, this kind of also, or the claim for citizenship, for example. So what do you mean when we talk about reparations? There is a lot of similarities. What do we mean by? But, the violence as such has very different. So I think I don't use the word comparison so because it's so loaded. But so I like this approach. That's why I called it connecting. So put them next to each other, but not in a comparative way, but if you relate them, you see something. It's like with a double biography. If you write about two people next to each other, you see more as you only write about one. I mean, this is just common truth in scholarship. And I think this is this mapping. Yeah, but it's a good question. I think there's definitely good to think about, what you can or might lose. Yeah, but I think many people think there's the danger of relativism, and they fight for, it's a specificity, and it has a lot to do with the identity discourse we have. But actually, looking at all these cases, there's really a lot of similarities, and just there to see them, and to because it makes every claim stronger, not weaker. Because if people see that they suffer from the state has, a way to put different groups at their space. The state has an interest, that there are no common, that people don't see the similarities between the different affairs and problems. So, yeah. So I think it strengthens claims instead of losing.
Thank you. Martina?
Yeah. Nicole, this was fascinating. So thank you very much. And of course, I was thinking all the time about what happens here. And one of the things I studied in conflict resolution is that the process of enemizing, of making another group an enemy, comes from denial and projection. So it definitely has to do with the way you relate to your own complexity, inside complexity. So it really rings the bell. But what I'm very, very curious to know is about, this kind of multi voices. You said it's not putting one next to the other. So I would like to hear more about how you do that inside the person. If each person is a universe and then you have all the voices inside, in a way of, I mean, if you really want to see another human being as a human being, you need to see that every person is a universe and it has everything. But how can you do that with an archive? So that's my question.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, of course, at the moment you dig then into life stories, it becomes very, complex and different. But maybe it's, for example, taking this Indonesian example. So many Indonesians diaspora in the Netherlands, they have this kind of binary position. They say, I'm either they identify very much for the Netherlands or they are from Indonesia. But it makes it very difficult to discuss what is this diaspora element. And this diaspora element is very, tricky because there's some nostalgia to it. You have a tradition from, a good tradition from Indonesia, but also a problematic tradition. But in order to look into these different legacies, you first have to acknowledge, yes, you are the diaspora and it has this different ingredients, yes, and which is difficult when you have a public space which has a binary the public discourse limits people also, to allow them these theological selves. For example, people who are in a recognition struggle, they would not say to you, no, I do have other identities as well, which are also valuable for me. As long, you fight for something, it's very difficult to listen to all the other aspects you carry in yourself too. So actually, I'm not getting the denial from the state or from another group makes you a very simplified person, because you, in a way, fight permanently for the acknowledgement of this aspect where you are denied in. And it does not, and this is why I blame, for this the state, that it does not allow the processing of those traumatic experiences, because when you deny acknowledgement for so long, people cannot multiply. It's very difficult to get access to all these different legacies we carry in us. And there is this, interchange between when the public discourse is so simplified, how can you expect then, that these complex histories and then we talk about colonialism. I mean, colonialism is completely reduced to a victim-perpetrator discussion, which does not do duty, to how it structures our society. But as long we have this neglect on the one hand, the other one, identity is also very simplified. But I think only after the recognition, so after, for example, Willem Alexander did the apology opened up a space where people said, okay, now we can talk about something else. And now actually the real talks only started. So only after this kind of acknowledgement of the historical, you can really dig into, the sublime aspects. And then I think it's what you also touched upon, that, some victimized groups have also perpetrator legacies. I mean, there are all these kind of complexities, but you can't dig into them before not something is settled also in the public space.
This is really depressing for us.
Yeah.
But I do have a question. I wanted to ask, actually, it's more of a methodological question, just so that I can understand about the bigger project. Are you looking at existing archives? Are you creating the archives yourself? And if you're the one creating those archives of interviews, can you tell us a bit about the structure of the interviews?
Yeah, I think, I'm working at the University of Humanistic Studies. It's a small university, and we are not an archive, institution. So for me, it's rather, so we give the interviews normally to the national archives where everything is stored. But then, you also have them there and you don't know who accessed them. And this archive is more a kind of idea. What can you do as researcher on your own homepage in order to display a little bit, not just writing articles, but really show whom you interviewed, in which ways, to show quotes, or not the whole thing, not typical archive work that that you provide everything, but that you provide certain things which speak back to a hegemonic narrative. So that it's a kind of curated archive in the sense of, what is the radical element, what people, why do they give the talk? What do they want to tell me? And then to display the content more. Where otherwise we end up, then you have 100, 200, 300 interviews about something. I mean, who is looking into these collections? I mean, we know we do it for history and we do it for all kind of reasons, but I think sometimes a lot gets lost through the massiveness of oral history collections we see now overall. So this is at least I think oral history started it started with a political claim, in the 50s, 60s, really to a counter voice to the hegemonic voice, criticizing power, and sometimes this criticizing voice is disappearing. At least I fear this. Do we really hear good enough what people tell us? And to what extent is this still critical? Or are those histories, the oral history is just confirming the mainstream? I mean, we have these collections, which call themselves but I wouldn't call them oral history collections, because in my definition, it really does, it challenged the status quo in which we are in, and, to reflect us as a society. And I think, interviewing marginalized people with marginalized position, I think this is the knowledge we get from them. They show us, who we are as society and what are the blind spots.
Sorry. Thank you. I said thank you, and I wanted to ask if there are additional questions from the audience. So before we'll end, I just want to say that I was very much captured by the two quotations you brought at the beginning about being labeled as a minority. It got me thinking, because when you got to the slide where you described Rothberg's work, Rothberg, when he wrote about multidirectional memory, he speaks about the archives of the minorities, but again, it's not a minority as a social position. And I thought that it's fascinating to take this idea into. I see a lot of similarities between the idea of multidirectional memory and the idea of multi-voices archives. Yeah, and the quest for those. I don't want to say similarities, but parallel themes, so thank you for that. It was very much illuminating. And I wanna, if you have anything else to add before we conclude, Nicole, do you wanna say anything else?
No, well, thank you very much for all the questions. And I was now also thinking this remark about, this denial. So also the denial. So what kind of voices, we don't want to listen, our own voices we don't listen to. And I think this is, the confronting bit.
Yeah.
With the dialogical self, to be also, to open up, because in situation like now where we have such a conflict, this polarizes, and you have clear identities, and it's there little space, public space. This really allows you to raise ambivalent, complex, questions, or a complex position. Actually, you should be right or left, or pro or against. So I think this is, and what this has to do with denial also in regard to ourselves. This was that's a good point. Martina, you have still a question.
Yeah, just exactly about that, about a minority. The first thing I thought is that as women, we are not a minority, but we are treated as a minority. And so it's the very first, what you say, think about ourselves. We should start with ourselves. This is very big because it goes, throughout the world. So it's not, so just that I couldn't, hold myself, sorry.
Yeah, but I think this is a really good point. Yes, you are not, but you are treated as this. And it makes you acting upon, while you're forced actually in this kind of frame.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for this fascinating talk. It really, I was so inspired, and I think we have a lot to talk about afterwards. But I want to thank you for your time, and I want to wish us all a quiet evening, and see you next time.
Thank you all, and see you next time.
Thank you.